Chapter 8, Part 1. The flow of time is always cruel.
You asked for this.
Zelda laughed as Rovin's arms squirmed behind his back. She had him pinned to the ground, tightly winding his elbow backward, causing his voice to reach a pitch she'd only ever heard from him when he was 10 years old.
Yeah, but not this,
he grunted.
All right, I yield.
She held him down for another few seconds, just because she could, but then let him up and watched with a smirk as he cradled his arm. Gee, Zelda, think you could be a little less savage next time? He had asked for one last spar before she had to leave on her journey through time. The prospect of it alone jarred her, the idea that she would be gone from the present and taking up space in a time where a younger version of her existed 4 years ago. She was still a princess, an almost 10-year-old girl running about the gardens and learning to sew, play music, and act like royalty. Part of her wished she could approach that version of herself and tell her everything, prevent all those terrible things from happening to her world. But Rauru had insisted that she must stay away from her past self and anyone who might know her, in fact. He claimed it could create chaos in the universe and cause rifts through time that would eat away at the present. She wasn't entirely sure what any of that actually meant, but it scared her, enough to keep her vigilant. Rovin leaned against a tree in the grotto where they'd been sparring, massaging his shoulder, and gave Zelda an indiscernible glance. She raised a questioning eyebrow.
Are you going to be upset with me forever?
She asked him. I've been bested by you before.
That's not what I mean, and you know it.
Rovin looked to the ground, chewing his lip.
Rovin, I must do this. I have no choice. Please don't allow me to leave this place with anger in your heart.
She winced on the inside, realizing the irony of that statement when it came to her and Impa. I have no anger toward you, Zelda, he replied, shaking his head in exasperation. It's not anger that plagues me. It's... He sighed, and Zelda shifted nervously. She wanted to shut this down, predicting where it was headed, but something inside froze her voice. After all, she would be alone on this journey. Completely alone. Maybe a bit of whatever it was Rovin felt for her could act as something she could cling to, an emotional anchor. He'd already acted as an anchor for her up to now, but would that be using him? She didn't know, so she let him gather his thoughts to speak. Something changed in his demeanor, and he seemed to have made a decision. He lifted his head and looked her straight in her eyes. He took 2 long strides toward her and pulled down her face wraps to cradle her face in his hands. There you are, he said. His eyes searched hers, looking for something. Something she couldn't give him. But she didn't pull away. Whatever was to happen, she would let it, if only to hold a memory of him that she could keep close, if only to know for certain that while she was away, bending time backward, someone loved her. I don't know if you'll come back from this, he whispered. So, I wanted to say that I know you don't feel the same way that I do. She cut him off with a kiss. It happened so fast. She was drawn to him, sucked in, like falling into her visions. As the kiss drew on, she felt her light magic flickering like a candle flame, coming to life. His feelings for her had always been obvious, but now, suddenly, they seemed incredibly real. Though it shamed her inside, she took advantage of this moment, accepted all of the love he was willing to give her. She took it in and shelved it away. They broke from each other, breathless, and she was filled with immediate regret.
I'm sorry,
she breathed. What had she done? You don't have to apologize.
No, I can't do this. I can't be what you need, Rowan.
He frowned, confusion morphing into hurt. This was what she was trying to avoid. She didn't want to cause him emotional pain from which he may never recover.
Please forgive me.
With tears in her eyes, Zelda turned and began to climb the cliffside back into town.
Zelda, wait!
He kept calling after her, but she ignored him. She focused on the climb, and when she reached the top, she did not look back. Telma squeezed Zelda until she had to shove her away to breathe again. The innkeeper had given her some sage advice about traveling, not through time, of course, but through lands. What kinds of places in which she could safely take refuge, what to look out for on the road, and what types of people to avoid, namely brigands, as if that wasn't obvious. She gently palmed Zelda's cheek and smiled sadly.
Dear princess, do be safe. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you, but you'll be all right. You've grown so much in the time you've been here, and I'm so very proud of you.
Zelda smiled back.
Thank you for being so welcoming to me, Telma. I'll miss you.
They hugged again, Zelda fighting back tears, and Telma letting hers loose. She turned to Impa, who stood silently to the side, as though she didn't want to interrupt the sentimental goodbye. Zelda thought about what she had told Rowan, that leaving on bad terms was not an option. Of course, that ship had now sailed with him, not least of which due to Zelda's stupid, emotional decision-making. But she would not allow the same thing to happen with Impa. Not anymore.
I wish I could change some things I've said and done. Let's not worry about any of that until you return, Princess. I want you to focus on the road ahead of you. Do not let the past disrupt your mission. It is the past, after all, through which you must navigate, and you have enough to deal with already.
Impa reached out a hand to her, and she took it gratefully. Zelda could no longer hold her tears. They embraced, something they hadn't done in ages. Impa held her tightly, but only for a few moments.
Take your destiny by the reins, and do not let go,
she said, and released her. Zelda blinked away her tears, unable to speak. She would be headed to the armor shop on her way out to say goodbye to Garen, and also to retrieve a gift from him. Rowan had not shown his face since their awkward encounter, so that would be it, their last goodbye, until, hopefully, she returned. She left the inn, shaking. Zelda almost turned and went straight to the stables to pick up her horse and go. She wasn't sure if she could handle another farewell, but before she could decide, Garen poked his bearded face out of the doorway, having seen her coming. Her initial instinct to run was replaced by amusement as he winked at her and gestured for her to walk inside.
You look like a Deku scrub popping your head out like that,
Zelda teased him. I've had worse things said about me, he replied with a chuckle. How are you feeling? She took a seat, leaning forward onto the back of the stool.
Lost,
she sighed.
Already lost. And I haven't even moved through time yet.
He sat across from her, in the same position. They often sat this way with each other when Garen was giving a lecture, or when they were just chatting. Garen was quite expressive, though you could only truly notice it through his eyes. Much like Zelda in her Sheik guise, she had learned to express emotion through them to communicate with people, but it had never been a trait that granted her much social prowess. Garen could relate. Think of all the times you were lost before. You found your way, and you will find it again. I've seen it firsthand.
Yes, well, much of that was due to the support of others. I won't have that support where I'm going.
Then find me, he said as if it were the simplest solution in the world. You can meet me daughter. She gave him a sad smile.
I appreciate the sentiment, Garen, but I can't. Rose said I am to avoid anyone who might know me. It could be dangerous. Even if I were to approach you as Sheik, you've already proven that you can identify me through my disguise.
Garen sighed in frustration. That Raru and his rules. Zelda laughed, feeling a bit lighter inside. If she were to meet Garen in the past, she knew he would be just as wonderful. Perhaps the thought alone could carry her through. That no matter when in time she'd be, he would be there too. Close. Another emotional anchor. This time, less selfish. Well, you can at least take something with you that'll remind you of me. He reached behind him and presented a cloth bundle, wrapped neatly. Perhaps you can pierce an eye or two with one of these. And if you do, think of me, will ya? He handed it over, and Zelda unwrapped it to reveal a set of beautiful, matte black kunai blades, their edges so sharp they almost sparkled. She had never seen these in the shop before. On cue, Garen said, I had these specially made for you. Tested them out myself. The balance is impeccable.
Oh, Garen, I can't begin to thank you.
So don't. Besides, I have another gift for you, but not for me. He reached behind him again, taking out something small enough to hide inside his fist. He brought this in an hour ago and told me not to let you leave without it. He opened his hand, and Zelda was slightly taken aback to find a compass sitting in his palm. It seemed to be made of brass and was rusted and old, but it was in good working condition, she thought, as she took it and moved it around in circles, watching the needle remain pointed to true north. She would ask Garen who left this to her, but she didn't need to. He said it belonged to his father, he told her quietly. Roven rarely spoke about his father. Zelda only knew that he had passed away. Roven had never told her how, and she had never pried, because that was not her way. They had bonded, however, over the fact that both of their fathers were gone. Just one aspect of their friendship that had kept it solid. As she gazed at it, she wondered how many treks it had been taken on. He also told me to tell you that his father died in the grotto. Zelda looked up at him in shock.
What?
Garen nodded. Hit his head on a rock and drowned. No one was around to save him. Roven said he liked being there because it was the last place his father was alive and happy. He said he wanted you to know that, to understand how he really feels. Garen spoke as if he empathized with Roven, and she supposed he could, considering all he wanted was to get back to Hyrule, where his own family had perished. She'd often wondered why he felt that way. She certainly desired to return to her castle, but the knowledge that her father died there kept her afraid of it as well. But perhaps it made more sense now. It was the last place he was alive and happy. Like Roven's father. Like Garen's family. Roven's obsession with the grotto made more sense too, and she now felt terrible for refusing to spend very much time with him there. How he really felt, she already knew. She gazed at the compass with new eyes.
Tell him I'll take care of it, and that I do understand.
It was almost noon according to the angle of the sunlight and shadows on the floor of the shop. She had to leave soon, but she needed to say one last thing.
Garen, please also tell Impa that I am sorry for everything. I should have given her more of a chance. I shouldn't have given up on her so soon. Who knows what I could have learned from her by now.
Garen smiled, his beard lifting with emotion. Princess, you have learned from her.
What do you mean?
His brow creased. I mean, I have been seeking advice from her ever since we started training, he said apologetically. Much of what you learned from me, you actually learned from her through me. She has always stayed with you. She has always loved you. Zelda scoffed in disbelief, shaking her head. Of course. Maybe she should be angry, but she only wondered how she could have ever doubted her loyal Impa, who stuck with her throughout her young life, who whisked her away to freedom and escape when she could have just saved herself. Why did she lose faith in her so easily? I'll tell her what you said, Garen continued. She already knows it. Zelda stood and wrapped her arms around Garen's large frame.
Thank you for taking your steps,
she whispered. It seemed he and Impa had taken more than she ever knew. Milana brought Zelda a brown and black speckled horse, a beautiful mare she'd often admired from afar.
Her name's Kami,
She said, tossing Zelda the reins.
She's a goddess among horses, so treat her like it, alright? She'll be well protected.
Zelda replied a little more curtly than she intended.
Ha! Not 'cause of you. I train my horses better than anyone. You questioning my talents?
Zelda sighed inwardly. Milana still despised Sheik and everything that came with his existence.
Wouldn't dream of it. Where are you going, anyway? Telma wouldn't give up the info when I asked. It's my own business.
Milana huffed a sarcastic laugh and leaned against the stable wall, crossing her arms.
You say goodbye to roving.
Zelda paused her arranging of the reins and gave Milana a sideways glance.
I did.
Milana raised her eyebrows.
Good. Wouldn't want you to miss out on that.
Zelda frowned, perturbed by Milana's line of questioning. Why would she care whether they had their goodbyes? She finished packing the saddlebags and mounted, shaking her head of the stable girl's strange envy.
Goodbye, Milana,
She said genially. Might as well leave on good terms with everyone. Milana didn't answer, but Zelda saw that she stared her down as Kami trotted through Kageno's front gates. A fire burned in her eyes that disturbed Zelda beyond understanding. If there was anything good about this lonely adventure, it was that she'd be away from those who despised her. She rode Kami hard for 2 straight days. Unlike 3 years ago, when she and Impa had fled to Kageno and Zelda had been ground to exhaustion, she now sat tall in the saddle, pushing the tiredness to the back of her conscious mind. Over the past year, Garen had taught her how to compartmentalize her physical reactions to outside stimuli. Or perhaps it was truly Impa from behind the curtain. Either way, Zelda knew how to hide away her discomfort in order to push on through. She rode north toward Lake Hyrule, thinking of how strange it would be to return home. Though it would not be the home that currently existed, it would be the one she remembered. She took solace in that, in the knowledge that at least she'd not be accosted with the horrific state of the current Hyrule. When the surroundings of Lake Hyrule came into view, her heart raced. This was it. Time to grab the reins of destiny, as Impa had so elegantly put it. Kami trotted up to a nearby tree on the southern shore of the lake, and Zelda halted her to tie her to it. The horse should be fine while she was away, because if all went well, she would disappear from this time, and then instantly reappear, having completed her tasks. Then she would ride Kami back to Kageno as though nothing happened at all. She stepped away from the mare, having made sure she could access the long tufts of grass growing around the tree, and ensured she was close enough to the lake to drink water, just in case. She took a step back and gazed around, taking in her surroundings. The lakeshore was abandoned, as usual. Only the fishing grotto and the laboratory took up any space near it, and those were on the north shore, far away from Zelda. She took in a deep breath of the fresh air. It smelled familiar here, nostalgic, but something was off, and she soon realized what. The lake wasn't as full. Water still lapped up to where Kami stood, but it was shallow. Had the tide simply changed? Or had something else happened? The harp pulled at her, distracting her from her rumination. She was procrastinating, she knew, but her fear was beginning to paralyze her. What if none of this worked? What if she couldn't find the sages? What if they didn't recognize her power? What if Rauru had some of the details wrong? So many variables. Too much potential for failure. She shook her head, trying to rid it of the anxiety. The harp called her again.
I hear you.
She said to it in her mind.
Just give me a moment.
It did not listen. It chimed at her. Calling, calling.
All right.
She shouted and wrenched it out of one of the saddlebags. It seemed to glow in her hands, and she felt that vibration again. That feeling of knowing she was supposed to do this. It didn't matter if she was afraid. Only Hyrule mattered. Only the hero mattered. And defeating the King of Evil. Zelda closed her eyes and allowed the power of the harp to fill her up as she began to play. She sang the Ballad of the Goddess in a high and sweet voice, directing all of her energy toward acknowledging the time to which she wished to transport. 4 years prior to now, when Hyrule was full of peace, when her father was still alive, when Link was just a young, naive boy living in the forest who had no idea what his future would hold. She sang, and her body warmed as her light magic rippled out from her limbs, swirling around her and mixing with the harp's power. She faintly heard Kami's nervous neighing in the background, but it faded, and without warning, everything stopped. She heard birds chirping and water sloshing. The sun warmed her face. She basked in it for a moment, then opened her eyes. Kami was gone. The area looked much the same, as did the time of day, but the grass wasn't as overgrown. The water was full to the brim, almost overflowing. But otherwise, it looked just like the Hyrule she knew. Had she come far enough into the past? Were her thoughts focused enough to bring her where Rauru wanted her? There was only one way to find out. She must enter the first temple and seek out its sage. Ryuta. That was the name of the Sage of Water, the first sage Rauru instructed Zelda to find. She knew next to nothing about her, only that she was a Zora, and she could be found behind a locked door deep in the recesses of the water temple. Zelda must find the key wherever it was, navigating through the temple's maze of trials in order to prove her worth and ability. The same would need to be done for every temple. Years from now, Link would attempt his own navigation of the very same places and awaken new sages, restoring the elemental and magical balance that kept Hyrule alive. When Rauru had been explaining all of this to her, she'd thought that maybe she could somehow communicate to Link how to traverse the temples. But Rauru interrupted her thoughts with the revelation that the temple rooms shifted every few years. Link would not be navigating them in the same way she would be. How convenient. She waded into the lukewarm water, grateful that today it was relatively still. While combat wasn't her best sport, swimming was another story. Her father would take her on excursions to the lake once she was old enough and taught her to swim. She remembered those days fondly. Impa and the king would pick her up and toss her back and forth and into the water, and she'd scream with delight, swim to the bottom to touch the ground, and come back up feeling on top of the world. Being submerged gave her a sense of calm. The water would muffle all other sound, and she'd feel like she was in her own universe. The stone marker Rauru had told her to look for came into view, and she dove, keeping her eyes open and paddling farther and farther down into the blue. A barely visible dark opening beckoned her, the entrance to the water temple, but it was blocked by a gate. She spotted a diamond-shaped crystal above it and promptly swam to it, clanging it as hard as she could with one of Garen's kunai blades. The gate raised, and her breath began to run out. She swam through the opening, surfacing inside the temple entrance. She was initially taken aback by the sheer size of the place. A multi-level column in the center of the main room boasted platforms and doors to who knew where. Various hallways puzzled outward from the outer walls, and she spotted a stone carving of the Triforce up on a ledge that was currently unreachable. That seemed significant, but how to get there? She took her time amazing through the hallways and noting which ones went in which direction. She soon discovered another Triforce symbol and a tiny inscription underneath it of the royal family crest. Instantly, she knew what she must do. A harp version of her very own lullaby always felt different to her. More mature, perhaps, than the ocarina. In her mind, it almost felt like Sheik's lullaby, rather than Zelda's. As she played it on the goddess harp, she felt the temple rumble, and water started to rise inside it. Soon she was treading water and having to figure out where the exit of the hallway was, as the place looked and felt wholly different when flooded. But she located it and swam up to the first Triforce carving she'd spotted, playing the same tune again and watching the room fill almost to the ceiling. Now she could access a large door at the very top of the center column that had been nagging at her. When she entered the room, her eyes widened at the sudden change in scenery. A wide expanse of pale skies and shallow water greeted her. The silence was stifling, as though something lurked somewhere within, just waiting for the chance to attack. She could hear her own breathing too loud in her ears. The tension became too much, and she drew her scimitar, scanning the room. A lone tree in the center caught her eye. It was dead, and its reflection in the water rippled. In fact, her own reflection seemed off somehow. She felt as though it was being watched, rather than her own solid body. She cautiously sloshed through the water toward the tree, expecting something to jump out at her, but was relieved when nothing did. She moved past the tree, giving it only a passing glance, and walked toward the door, but found it was locked.
Oh no,
She whispered. Turning around, something else caught her eye by the tree. Something that hadn't been there before. A figure. A dark figure.
Hello?
She asked, her voice shaking. The figure did not move. She edged toward it, unblinking. This was a test, she was sure. Rauru said she would encounter many trials in these temples, but what would this one entail? She moved closer, her brow furrowed in confusion. The figure looked like her, more specifically, like Sheik. It seemed to be an almost solid silhouette, every inch of it dark as the night. It clutched her scimitar as well, or at least a duplicated one made of shadows. Zelda narrowed her eyes. Was this version of her a tangible one? Or was it simply a mirage to disorient her? As if in answer, Dark Sheik jumped into the air, flipped and landed in front of Zelda, who took a fighting stance. It mirrored her movements exactly. And Zelda knew she must battle this seemingly evil version of herself. In the 5 minutes since the fight began, Dark Sheik had copied every single tactic Zelda had thrown at it. Twirls, flips, parries, attacks. They had simply been mirrored, and no matter what Zelda did, she couldn't seem to trick it into faltering. It was like it could read her thoughts, or perhaps even experience them simultaneously. What was this magic? She began to tire a little. In a normal fight, her attacker would be making their own moves in variable ways, but fighting someone who acted exactly as she did somehow made her exhaustion come on quicker. But as she slowed, so did Dark Sheik. She needed to figure out how to take advantage of this mirroring and turn it against the figure. She began experimenting, jumping backward to see if Dark Sheik would, sidling in different directions, raising her left arm, then her right. Every movement was mirrored. What could she do that Dark Sheik couldn't? Or perhaps, what did she have that Dark Sheik didn't? It seemed to have copied everything of Zelda that it could see. But what about what wasn't visible? She pulled out a kunai blade and watched as Dark Sheik made the same motion, but pulled nothing from the sheath attached to its inner tunic. In one swift motion, Zelda jumped at the shadowy being with her kunai raised and her scimitar lowered. It leapt at her as well, but with nothing in hand, and was forced backward as her weapon slashed at it. It actually grunted as though feeling pain, but didn't bleed, and then rose up again and resumed the fight. But it didn't take much longer. Zelda sliced the figure 3 more times before it finally jumped backward and seemed to fall right through the watery floor as though nothing was there. She wanted to feel shocked at that, but couldn't really muster it. She'd seen too many strange things already. Breathless, she sheathed her weapon and turned toward the door to see that a chest had appeared in front of it. She opened it to find a golden key. Her sense of accomplishment rose inside her, and she rushed toward the door to unlock it, but then hesitated, twirling the key in her fingers. What if this wasn't all? Simply opening a locked door might be too easy, but she supposed she'd never know unless she unlocked it. The lock made a satisfying click, and she was able to turn the knob and push it open, entering a small room. The walls made of bright silver oval-shaped carvings. A pool of water filled the center, and the walls seemed to move with the rippling shimmer it reflected.
You must have truly wanted to see me if you willingly conquered the mirrored realm,
a voice said from behind her, causing her to jump. She turned to see a most beautiful Zora woman standing in front of her. The fins on her head were heart-shaped, which Zelda had never seen before, and her eyes glowed bright blue against her dark blue scales.
Ryuta?
Zelda said, feeling a bit frozen.
That is me, yes. If you know my name, then you must have heard of me from someone.
Zelda nodded.
I did. From the Sage of Light. From Hyrule.
Recognition sparked in the Zora's eyes, and she looked at Zelda up and down.
Are you in disguise?
Zelda's eyes widened as she realized that she was still in full Sheik gear, her face wraps up and her eyes red as rubies. She quickly pulled down the wraps to reveal her face.
Yes. I'm sorry. I should introduce myself. I am Princess Zelda of Hyrule. I'm from the future.
As the words stumbled out, she realized with embarrassment how odd they sounded. But Ryuta didn't seem fazed. Instead, she just seemed curious.
The future? How far into the future? 4 years. Not that far.
Ryuta said with a smirk. Zelda hoped the Zora didn't think this was some sort of jest.
I've come to learn your sage's song, the Serenade of Water. I have a harp.
She revealed the instrument from behind her back and offered it to the sage, who took it with interest.
This harp holds power. Much power.
She looked up at Zelda.
You are to use this for some future event. Something bad is going to happen.
She was simply stating a fact, and didn't even look concerned.
Yes. I'm sorry to say, but that's correct. Learning your song will aid me in ensuring that that bad thing won't destroy our home.
Ryuta raised her chin. Zelda wondered if she might have been royalty. She certainly acted and looked the part. And if Zelda, a princess herself, could be called as a sage, she was sure other royalty could be as well. Ryuta handed the harp back to her.
The flow of time is always cruel, isn't it?
She felt truer words had never been spoken.
I will aid you. Please listen carefully.
Ryuta pulled out a flute from underneath her fins and began to play her song. Zelda followed along until she found the right notes, and they played it together with harmonic flow. It was a full and rich tune, and made her think of the temple and all its cleverness. When they finished, Zelda smiled at Ryuta and thanked her.
Your help will not be forgotten. Promise me you'll take care, and stay vigilant.
All she could think of was that this poor woman would be dead in little time, and she could do nothing to stop it, nor even warn her. So that advice was the best she could think of, in lieu of telling her the full truth. She was about to leave, but then thought better of it. She had to know.
Ryuta, what was that shadow creature?
Ryuta raised an eyebrow.
It is the depths of you, where the potential for evil lives, as it does in everyone, even the most heroic of us.
Zelda had a hard time imagining what evil could live inside her, but then remembered how she'd shunned Impa, acted like a complete brat to her, and then took advantage of Rovin's love like it didn't even matter. Perhaps what the sage said was true. Everyone was capable of evil. Ryuta sent her on with an embrace and well wishes. And as Zelda played the Serenade of Water, transporting herself magically through space to the middle of Lake Hylia, she prayed to the goddesses that every sage would be this amiable. The peaceful atmosphere of Kakariko Village never ceased to leave Zelda in awe. Its aura was much different from Kageno, which bustled with people on the regular, and left her with a sense of calm. In fact, it almost made her sleepy. Or perhaps she just needed rest after what she had just been through. Rest sounded nice. She decided to book a room at the inn and stay the night. Recuperation would do her some good and give her energy to reach the fire temple tomorrow. The name alone frightened her, not to mention the fact that it nestled right inside Death Mountain, a craterous volcano visible from the village. How anyone could settle next to a volcano, she couldn't understand, but the people here seemed unbothered by it. She entered the village's only inn, which also had a different feel from Kageno's. It was much smaller, only had 3 rooms, according to the sign outside, and no kitchen. Thankfully, she had brought her own sustenance with her. A tiny, hunched old woman stood at the front desk, speaking with the inn owner in hushed tones. The owner saw Zelda enter and pointedly cleared his throat. "Granny, we have a visitor." "Welcome, sir. May I help you?" Granny turned, and Zelda tried not to react to her wizened look. In her Sheik voice, she managed to say,
Thank you. I need a room, please. Just for the night.
"You're in luck. We have 3 empty rooms to choose from," he chuckled. "Not very many folks taking advantage these days." She found that sad. The village had been in decline for years now, and it seemed businesses closed left and right.
I'm sorry to hear that, but I appreciate your kindness.
Granny kept her eyes on Zelda, while the owner checked her in and handed her a key. As she climbed the stairs, the old woman continued staring, and a slow smile spread across her face. Zelda hurried inside her room and locked the door behind her. Peaceful or not, Kakariko was home to some terribly interesting characters. The next day dawned with a storm, causing the already quiet town to go silent. Zelda watched from the window as rain cascaded in torrents, There was no way she'd be able to get to Death Mountain today, not without soaking herself to her core. She would wait it out, at least until it lessened. An antsy feeling crept into her limbs, so she decided to go sit in the lobby downstairs. The owner offered her a mug of hot tea when she arrived, which she gratefully accepted. And she in turn offered her company. It wasn't like the man had much to do with his declining business after all. They sat at a small table in the corner. "Name's Byrne," he told her.
Sheik,
She responded.
I'm a friend of Impa's.
"Impa, what a coincidence. She was just visiting yesterday before you arrived. She brought that little princess along with her. Such a sweet girl." Zelda's heart skipped a beat. Thank the goddesses she missed that. "What are you doing in Kakariko? Just passing through?"
Yes. In fact, could you tell me how to get to Death Mountain?
Byrne frowned. "Why would you want to go there?" Zelda hesitated. Obviously, it wasn't anyone's priority to visit a volcano for fun.
I'm doing some research.
She lied.
Geographic.
She decided to be as vague as possible. No use spinning a complicated web of lies she'd end up having to unravel. That explanation seemed to satisfy him somewhat. "You're a brave soul to be tackling research there. It's a dangerous road. The mountain has been occasionally erupting, and there are no shelters on the path. You'd need something to protect yourself, not to mention how hot it can get, especially if you're looking to go inside."
I am.
She confirmed.
I know the dangers. I just need to know the logistics of getting there.
"Well, I'd recommend going to Granny's. She concocts some potent spells and potions. One of them could protect you from the heat." He seemed to consider something. "One moment," he said, and got up from the table to disappear into the back room. In a few seconds, he came back out with a shield. "This was left by a patron. It's made of metal, so it should protect your body from any falling rocks." He handed it over, and Zelda examined the dented metallic surface. It had no symbols or carvings on it of any kind. It was just a simple steel shield, large enough to cover her back, and perhaps her head if need be. It was definitely beat up, but looked strong.
Thank you. This is helpful.
She withdrew some rupees from her pocket, but Byrne refused them. "Don't worry about it," he winked. "The road leading to the mountain is on the west side of the village. It's currently unguarded, but the castle guard has been short-staffed. That's why Impa was here. She's working out a deal for us. Always looking out for us, that Impa." Zelda smiled beneath her face wraps.
She's a remarkable woman.
2 hours later, the storm abated and the rain stopped, and she made her way to Granny's shop. She had to be let in through the back of a different store, and marveled at the strange smells and sights that greeted her. Granny sat mixing potions and gave Zelda that same creepy smile.
Hello. I was hoping...
I already know what you want, my dear. And who am I to refuse you? You are, after all, royalty.
I'm no such thing.
Oh, don't play your little games with me, princess. I have the sight, you know. I can see what others around us cannot or will not see.
Zelda simply stood there, aghast. This went against everything Rauru had warned her about. She didn't want something terrible to happen because she was found out. But if this woman had the sight, perhaps it was much too late anyway. Maybe this was supposed to happen. In her true voice, she spoke quietly.
I cannot let anyone else find out who I am. You must keep this a secret, please. Don't worry your pretty head. I have always been good at keeping secrets, because I have so many.
She cackled at her little joke, and Zelda resisted the urge to roll her eyes.
Sit down, and I'll start making your magical potion.
She did so, experiencing flashbacks to Professor Robbie and his strict yet comfortable lectures.
You already know which potion I need. Girl, don't you listen when someone speaks to you. I told you I have the sight. Now wait there and do be patient.
She grumbled something about children and their inability to wait, while Zelda patiently waited. She seemed a little off in the head, but she got right to work making a potion that smelled of mint and swirled with a bluish color. Somehow, Zelda trusted without a doubt that the potion would do what she needed. Granny ladled the liquid into an empty bottle and corked it neatly. She even placed a label on it, smearing some kind of homemade glue onto the parchment and sticking it evenly across the bulging glass. Taking the bottle from her, Zelda read, "Granny's Odd Spells." A fitting name, she thought.
Now, don't drink that until just before you need it. It will last you approximately 4 hours and will stave off heat and flame. But if you are caught in either when it runs out, don't come crying to me with your burns.
The woman was abrasive, but Zelda couldn't help but chuckle inwardly at her big attitude. Either way, she got what she needed and was prepared.
I thank you, Granny. This helps more than you know.
You really don't listen, do you? I do know.
Of course, you have the sight.
Now you're getting it.
Zelda stood up to leave, but Granny made a huffing noise.
Girl, just because you're royalty doesn't mean you get everything for free. I'm not as generous as Burn. 50 rupees, please.
My apologies.
She paid the woman, who, of course, counted every rupee.
Very good. Now, say hello to Rocco for me, would you?
Zelda balked.
You know the Sage of Fire.
I have as many friends as I do secrets.
Granny winked, and then went back to stirring her potions, seemingly having dismissed her. The path up to the mountain stretched dauntingly high, and though the sky where she stood now was clear, she saw the ring of smoke that circled the mountaintop, and watched as orangey glowing rocks spewed out of the mouth. She clutched her shield closer. The longer she waited, the longer it would take to learn the song she needed. She had to go now. Hiking up the shield so that she could easily pull it over her head, Zelda hurried forward onto the path. Almost instantly, and like magic, fiery rocks began to tumble from the sky, crashing to the ground in a dramatic display of flames and debris. She crouched, positioning the shield above her head, and felt the crushing pressure of multiple rocks pummeling it. Just as she thought they might not stop, the pressure released, and the loud noises abated. She stood to see the skies had cleared again, a strange transformation that should not be possible. It seemed this mountain had some sort of power itself. She ran as far as she could before the rocks rained down again. And again it was temporary. This happened twice more before she finally reached a wall with footholes carved into it where she could climb. This adventure was seriously testing her physical capabilities, she thought, as she wrenched herself over the ledge at the top with a grunt. Thankfully, it seemed the fiery rocks had ceased their attempts to demolish her, and she could feel the heat emanating from it. She pulled out the potion from Granny and downed it, pleasantly surprised at the sweet and minty taste. Instantly, a cooling sensation spread throughout her, and she saw a faint blue glow emanate from her form. 4 hours. She must find the Sage of Fire within 4 hours. The heat could still be felt inside Death Mountain, but it remained bearable. The innards of this place were seeped in molten pools where large boulders melted and lava bubbled. A long bridge stretched out above the lava and looked frighteningly unsteady, but she took a cautious step onto it, and then another, and another, and soon she had reached the end where another entrance stood. Suddenly she was inside the fire temple and marveled just as much at its atmosphere as she had the water temple. 3 large stone faces holding fire inside the mouths greeted her, the architecture of the place earthy and ancient. For the first time, she wondered how long these temples had existed. Raku, the sage here, was apparently a newer sage. One Raru said, Zelda may have to work harder to convince. As she did in the water temple, Zelda began to traverse the different rooms. Some areas large and sprawling, and others tight and claustrophobic. One room was a sort of maze with a boulder that rolled through it. She carefully followed it until she found a ladder that reached a door. Pausing, she saw that the floor in this next room was actually a grate, and the lava below it bubbled up, releasing fumes. She didn't want to walk across it, feeling even less secure about it than the long bridge, but she made herself, as she could see another door on the other side of the room. But when she stepped on the grate, the pressure in the air shifted. Zelda whipped around, hearing a loud pop and sizzle, and saw, to her horror, a literal wall of flame moving across the floor and right toward her. There was nowhere to run but forward, and so she did, as fast as she humanly could, her lungs burning with the molten gases that pervaded the air. She tried to cough them out, but only choked, and looked back to see the flaming wall was barreling closer, moving quicker than she was. She pushed herself harder, though she knew the potion she'd taken should protect her from flame. This was a kind of flame that she'd never seen before. She didn't know whether anything could protect her from it, so run she did. Finally, she reached the end of the grate, but realized almost too late that there was a gap to jump. She ran harder, pushing herself to her limit, and leapt across it, somersaulting and slamming into the door before scrambling up and wrenching it open. Just as she closed it, she felt the flaming heat reach it and jumped backwards, only to find that it did not reach the boundary. Zelda gasped and choked, clutching her chest and coughing. She collapsed on the ground, trying to recover, and unaware that someone was watching her. A looming figure stepped into her view, and she startled, gazing up into the face of a huge, barely clothed Goron, who simply grinned at her.
Goddesses! You sages need to stop popping up like that.
She said between coughing fits. The Goron made a curious noise and held out a hand to help her up. She took it, clearing her throat and finally feeling as though she could breathe right. "What's Ashika doing in here?" Raku asked, tilting his head to study her. She took a deep breath.
I'm here to learn your song, Roku. I've been sent by Roru from the Sacred Realm, so that I may prevent horrible things from happening in Hyrule's future. My name is Princess Zelda.
She revealed her face to him, and his beady eyes grew wider. "Princess Zelda? Aren't you supposed to be younger?"
I'm the Zelda from the future, Roku, where some of those horrible things have already occurred. In order to prevent more, I need to learn the Bolero of Fire.
It was Zelda's turn to tilt her head.
Wait a moment. Aren't you supposed to be behind a locked door? This door wasn't locked at all, thank the goddesses.
Raku's rocky face took on a flush, which surprised her. She didn't know Gorons could flush. "I like to wander the temple sometimes, even though I shouldn't. I get bored. There's nothing to do here." She supposed that made some sense. Being all alone in these haunting temples was probably not the most fun existence. Raku brought a hand to his chin. How do I know you're telling the truth? You seem like a Sheikah to me. You have red eyes and you wear the clothing. You escaped the wall of fire, so you must have some skill. Who are you really?
I'm only in disguise. My eyes are magically colored red, and these clothes are simply a way to hide.
She remembered something.
Would it help if I told you that Granny says hello?
Raku's eyes lit up with delight. Granny! She makes the best rock roast I've ever had. You know Granny too?
I met her today, in fact. She gave me a cooling potion, so that I could come to you. You can trust me, Roku. Here, take a look at this.
She handed him the goddess harp, and as Ryuta had, he reacted to its power, and a sudden understanding came over him. Well,
This is the most interesting thing that's happened to me in here,
he said, and proceeded to teach her the song on a set of small drums. The melody was quick and steady, and keeping time took some doing, but she managed. When they finished, Raku gave her a sad smile.
I didn't want to be a sage, you know. I'm still very young for a Goron. The calling took me here and I resisted it, but in the end I had to come. Sometimes I miss my home and my friends.
Zelda's heart broke for him. He was so sad and lonely, and in just a short time he would be murdered by Ganondorf himself. Her guilt ate away at her soul.
But you, Princess, you've given me something to do. If terrible things are going to happen to Hyrule, then I will do everything in my power to prevent them. I'll do my sage duties, and I'll protect this place.
His determination saturated the air around him. She blinked back tears and smiled back at him.
Good for you, Roku. You're destined to be a sage, and you belong here. You have a purpose.
He nodded his thanks. Zelda squeezed his rock-hard shoulder, saying her farewells, and played the Bolero of Fire again to transport herself back to the entrance of the mountain. 2 down, 3 to go, and each one was going to wrench her heart from her, bit by bit. A few miles' walk southeast across Hyrule Field led Zelda to Kokiri Forest, and she stood now at its entrance, afraid to walk inside. This was where Link lived. As a little boy, free and unaware, would she come across him? Talk to him? No, she should figure out where the Lost Woods was, and go straight there without talking to anyone if she could help it. But her feet seemed glued to the ground. Maybe she should wait to tackle the Forest Temple. She still had 2 others to conquer. She could turn around and... A quiet jingle broke through her chaotic thoughts. She knew that sound. She moved forward, cautiously but steadily. Through the forest entrance, she found a wooden bridge leading to another opening. The clearing below her stretched east and west, and Zelda saw a ladder leading to yet another entrance. That jingle sounded again, and she darted her eyes around looking for it. She knew what it was. She just needed to spot it. They were quick and clever, only making themselves known to those they trusted or were very curious about. If it didn't want to be found, it wouldn't be. But why would it be letting her know of its presence? Her eye caught a sudden green flash darting into a bush below the bridge. Zelda jumped down, the distance was only a few feet, and quietly approached the bush.
Hello? I saw you. You can come out. I promise I won't hurt you.
The tiny green fairy peeked from the bush. It had no discernible face or body, just a glowing ball of light and wings. But fairies could speak and guide those they bonded with. Zelda knew this because of Link. His fairy Navi had come to him to tell him of his fate and offered her help at the behest of the great Deku Tree. Link and Navi had both been severely impacted by the great Deku Tree's death. He was the first victim of Ganondorf's awful curse, but Navi kept Link alive, determined, and encouraged. She guided him loyally and without judgment. She even helped him in combat by directing his senses. Fairies truly were very useful. Link had told Zelda that not all fairies were like Navi, however. Some were sassy and belligerent. It usually depended on the temperament of the Kokiri with which they bonded, and if they hadn't bonded with anyone yet, you never knew what kind of personality you'd encounter. So she would approach this fairy with cautious optimism.
Hello there.
She said to it.
I'm Sheik. What's your name?
The fairy rose into the air and hovered, staying a ways away.
Sir,
It said in a high-pitched voice.
are you looking looking for a Kokiri?
No, actually, I'm looking for the Forest Temple. Could you point me in the right direction?
Sen began laughing hysterically.
I'm sorry, have I said something funny?
You won't be able to get there.
And why not? I'm certainly capable. I've already been to 2 other temples, thank you.
Already Zelda could see the goofy personality this fairy possessed.
The right direction is relative, Sheik. You're not of the forest, so you can't see the direction. You can't see any direction here.
She shook her head in confusion, trying to comprehend Sen's little riddle.
I don't understand. How can I see?
Well, if you really want to go there, I suppose I can guide you. But the way is full of terrible dangers. Murderous beasts, giant guardians, and a maze of woods that goes on forever unless you know the way.
Well, it seemed Zelda would have her very own fairy companion, just like Link.
Alright, Sen, I accept your guidance. Where shall we go first?
First things first, tell me your real name.
Sen dashed around Zelda's frame as though checking her out. How did this keep happening? She didn't want to cause Sen to retract their invite, so she decided she might as well cooperate. She sighed in resignation.
I'm Zelda.
She said in her true voice.
I knew it! Your aura is different from your facade, Zelda. You should be aware of that if you want to stay hidden.
Auras. Apparently, fairies could see auras. Zelda didn't even know what that meant, but she was so tired of questioning everything she was told, so she just accepted it.
Noted. Now can we go?
Sen flew up the ladder that Zelda had seen earlier.
Follow me!
Despite this fairy's quirks, Zelda was so very glad Sen was with her. The farther they navigated into the Lost Woods, turning this way and that, through transitional spaces that all looked exactly the same, the more she realized she would never have been able to figure out the maze on her own. But Sen flew confidently, guiding Zelda as promised. Eventually, they came to the end of the disorienting labyrinth and into a small clearing. Sen jumped in front of Zelda, stopping her from continuing.
What is it?
This is where things get dicey. Through this clearing is another sort of maze, and it's easier to get through, but there are giant guardians protecting it. We're gonna have to sneak around them. Can you be sneaky, Zelda?
I'm rather good at it, actually.
Great! I'm going to hide in your pocket.
Sen made a beeline for her face wraps.
What? You're not going to guide me through it?
Sen's muffled voice called out, their wings tickling her neck.
Don't worry, you can do this. Just make sure you're careful around those corners.
Guide indeed.
Zelda thought. She took 2 steps towards the opening to the maze, and a sudden haunting howl filled her ears with dread. Some kind of wolf-like creature ripped itself from beneath the ground and charged Zelda, its mouth foaming and its eyes glowing. On instinct, she pulled her shield in front of her and drew her scimitar.
Sen! How do I fight this thing?
You don't. It's too strong, Zelda. Distract it.
The creature stalked her, pawing at the ground and growling low. Distracted? How in Hyrule was she to do that?
If you can get through that opening over there, there's a button you can push to raise the gate.
Zelda began to inch to her right, toward the opening. The growls became louder. The beast looked as if it may rush her at any second, but she kept moving. The closer she could get, the easier it would be to... Without warning, the beast lunged. Zelda let her combat training take over, and she felt herself somersault just past its massive body, avoiding its razor-sharp claws by inches. She popped up and sprinted toward the opening. Sen left her face wraps and sped over to the button, turning a different shade of green to keep her attention on it. Zelda jumped through the opening, aiming for the rusty-looking switch on the ground, and landed perfectly. A loud click sounded, and the gate's metal bars shot up from the ground, creating a strong barrier between the duo and the raving beast. The creature whined as it realized it couldn't get past, slunk away, and disappeared back into the earth from which it had risen. Panting, Zelda sheathed her weapon and shield and leaned against the grassy wall next to her, resting her head on it.
You forgot to mention the wolf monster, Sen.
It's called a wolfos. Besides, those things pop up everywhere all the time. You would have had to encounter one eventually.
Thanks for the tip.
Sen moved their body as though giving a nod.
Now it's time to sneak.
Zelda rolled her eyes as Sen took refuge in her face wraps again. She peeked around the corner, just as the fairy had suggested, anxiously waiting to see a looming and dangerous beast marching the aisle, ready to crush her into sludge, and saw a Deku scrub. A giant guardian to a fairy, certainly. Zelda smiled, half amused and half annoyed. Sen wanted her to sneak, but she simply brandished her metallic shield as the scrub noticed her presence. It made a little jumping motion and shot some kind of seed at her, an attack she'd only ever heard about from Link, who had, of course, encountered more than his fair share of the unthreatening creatures. The seed pounded into her shield more violently than she was ready for, and it pushed her body backward a bit. The scrub then shot 3 more seeds in quick succession, forcing her to protect herself through the barrage. Perhaps they were more threatening than she gave them credit for. She took her time, moving forward between attacks and backing away once she passed by the silly, leafy monster. Around the next corner, 2 other scrubs spotted her, giving her the same grief. But she found a rhythm to it all, and successfully maneuvered around them. Eventually, she came upon a set of stairs, and rushing up, let out a sigh of relief when she saw nothing waiting to kill her at the top. Another set of stairs led her to yet another clearing, this time a dead end. A small stump sat underneath a stone ledge, which was covered in rich, thick green vines. This felt like the heart of the woods, like something magical lived here. She felt overwhelmed by the mysterious power the place seemed to breathe. Sen finally poked their body out, then flew over to the stump.
Saria likes to sit here and play her ocarina. She communes with the forest spirits. They like her.
That name sounded familiar, and she seemed to recall Link saying it once or twice. A friend back home, perhaps?
Sen, where is the temple from here?
Sen flew up to the stone ledge.
You'll need to climb up here somehow. The temple is just beyond.
Zelda smiled. If there was one good thing about hanging about in the grotto all these years, it was that she had learned to climb vines a long time ago. She quickly scanned the wall beneath the ledge, looking for footholds, and spotted a good number of divots she could use. Then went slowly, testing each foothold and vine before putting all her weight on them. Once or twice the wall crumbled away, and she had to catch herself, but she fairly quickly reached the ledge and pulled herself over it.
Wow! You're pretty good at that.
Sen flew back to Zelda's side.
Are you ready to go in?
Zelda made a grunt of assent, determined, and crossed through the dark threshold. The ancient feeling of the forest temple was almost suffocating. Zelda could not imagine how old the moss-covered stones were, the overgrown tiles, or the gazebo in the center of the entrance room. 4 gold torches surrounded it, all lit up. A series of locked doors surrounded the circular room, but Zelda had a feeling the gazebo had more to do with finding the Sage of Forest than those doors.
Sen, do you think that gazebo does anything?
I think what's around the gazebo is more interesting.
The torches. You would think them being lit would induce something.
Or perhaps they're preventing something from happening.
It clicked in Zelda's mind. She pulled out her canteen and rushed over to the closest torch, putting out the flame with the water. She waited for it to sizzle. Then she rushed to each subsequent torch and did the same. And as the last flame went out, the gazebo began to lower. Zelda ran and slid herself into the gazebo just before it could squash her. Sen right at her shoulder. As it moved to the next level below them, Zelda watched a child-aged boy, all dressed in green, move into view. His clothes were much like Link. The boy stood with his eyebrows raised, but didn't seem afraid. Zelda knew he was a Kokiri, part of an immortal line of spirits who wandered the earth as children. Their innocence was famous, as was the belief that if they left the forest, they would die.
Hello? Mori, yes?
Mori smiled, but kept his eyes on Sen floating next to her. I have never seen such a sight before. A Sheikah with a forest fairy. How did such a thing come to be? Though his voice was young, his words held a maturity that surpassed how old he looked.
I guided Zelda here. She made it through many dangers to see you. She quite impressed me.
Zelda flushed a little. She never thought the commendations of a fairy would feel so honoring. Zelda? As in Princess Zelda? She nodded and went about explaining what she had had to twice already. Mori seemed to keep up and never looked suspicious.
So now, I need to learn the minuet of forest, Mori, if you would be so kind.
Zelda let him examine the goddess harp, and his eyes lit up with intrigue. If the Sage of Light wishes me to do this, I will. He fished in a pocket and brought out an ocarina. It was a small one, wooden and unpainted. It didn't shine with power like the Ocarina of Time did, but it made Zelda smile regardless. Mori played his song for her, and she followed along, learning the notes and the strumming pattern. The tune was sweet and pleasant, less haunting than the other two songs she'd learned thus far. It gave her a full feeling in her heart. Mori shook Zelda's hand. I lost my fairy when I became a sage, he said. It's good to see one again. It's like a little bit of home. The serenity on his face captivated her. She looked over to Sen, whose wings had seemed to wilt.
Sen, why don't you stay with Mori?
She asked, the realization striking her like lightning.
You led me here, to the Sage of Forest. Your destiny intertwined with mine, and now you're here, with a Kokiri who doesn't have a fairy companion.
Sen seemed to perk up, and Mori smiled wide.
I know another boy who also doesn't have a fairy, yet, but he will get one, and they will be bonded forever. That feeling is sacred, special, and you both deserve it.
Do you mean Link? Zelda lightly gasped.
You know him?
Well, I've never met him, but I commune with the Great Deku Tree daily with my ocarina. He has told me about the boy without a fairy named Link, who is destined to save Hyrule from certain evils. Tears welled up in Zelda's eyes.
Yes, that is the very same boy. I am so happy to hear that he is all right.
I'm glad to deliver good news. Sen cautiously flew over to Mori, bobbing at him.
I'm Sen. I'm happy to meet you, Mori.
Zelda stepped away from the two with a smile to let them bond, and she quietly strummed out the Minuet of Forest, allowing it to magic her back to the Lost Woods. Next, she would approach the Shadow Temple. The place had been a legend on the lips of Kakariko residents for many years. Impa had told her stories of its mystery, that it was full of the dead, and it was used by the royal family during the Civil War in order to torture their prisoners. That was her next destination, and whether she liked it or not, her destiny was whisking her toward it fast. The flow of time, indeed, was always cruel. Next time on Path of Shadow.
What's next? What do you have for me? Throw it at me. Go ahead.
The floor fell out from beneath her feet, and Zelda screamed in terror as she plunged downward, with only seconds to wonder if she would survive it.
Kage, is it true that my family tortured your people here?
A row of traps lay in front of her, dried blood coating the floor.
And you, my dear, you possess the Triforce of Wisdom.
Zelda turned slowly, her breathing quickening, and raised her eyes to gape at the searing, malevolent face of Ganondorf.
Karen!
Use your harp! Go back in time. You can change it.
No, Reuben, I can't. No one can change it.